Okay, our specific look at specific gods and goddesses begins fittingly with Zeus, who of the Olympian generation of deities. Of course, he's the guy at the top. So sometimes called, yes, the king of the gods, the father of gods and men. He's one of the best known deities, even from those who have no experience with Greek mythology at all. So as we saw in our stories with our look at creation stories, he is at root, he's a sky god, the central deity in polytheistic systems that are kind of patriarchal. At the center, have the sky god at the top of the food chain, so to speak, and Zeus is no different. So he's an anthropomorphized deity. He's very human in his aspect, in his attitude, in his anger, in his lusts, and his pride. But his core identity has to do with the sky, and so Homer calls him the thunderer, the cloud gatherer. He's associated with the lightning bolt, the thunderbolt, that is often depicted as kind of clutching in his hands, which is kind of a symbol of kind of his arbitrary, violent power, which we'll see examples of down the line. Now, the name Zeus, as the name with so many of these deities, they often will not have a kind of obvious kind of Greek roots that we can etymologically pull apart to tell us what they mean. It's very likely that the name Zeus just is at its root a word that just means kind of masculine deity. Father deity, and we can see this by kind of doing some linguistic comparison. One of the ways that the Greeks would address Zeus in prayer would be to address him as Zeu Pater, Father Zeus. And as I'm sure some of you know, the Romans later adopted much of the Greek pantheon, and gave them their own Roman names. And so the Roman Zeus is Jupiter. Or if you go over to the subcontinent of India and you look at in Sanskrit mythology, the name of their principal sky deity, Diupiter. And if you do a little kind of Sesame Street comparison here, Zaupater, Jupiter, Diupiter, it's very clear, etymologically speaking, that they all belong to the same kind of root. Pater means father. The Zau, the Jew, the Diu on the front side of it likely is a word just meaning kind of generic sky masculine deity. So Zeus likely means something like father god or something along those lines. Now, as we'll see as we look at the various gods and goddesses, is that they all will have multiple associations. They'll have various kind of spheres of influence, even though they're usually kind of popularly known as by one or two of those. But one of the things I want you to take away from this class is how complex this can be. So, and Zeus is a very complex and in many ways very paradoxical kind of figure. So, for example, he is a god of justice. He's a god of laws, a god of society. When if you've had any experience with Greek myths and stories about Zeus and how he behaves, he's arguably one of the most unjust deities that there is. A god who, in many cases, just seems to be in it purely for himself and his own desires. But nevertheless, he is a god of human justice. He is the god for humans that you swear your most binding oaths in the name, in his name. He is one of his nicknames was Zeus Xenos, the god of the foreigner, the god of the stranger, and so the protector of the stranger that comes to your door. Now, this will become a very important thing once we get into the Odyssey, where we'll encounter this kind of unwritten code of hospitality, which the Greeks called xenia. This idea that it's really rooted in the idea that you never know when the stranger, the beggar who shows up in your doorstep, you never know when that might be one of the gods in disguise, or more specifically, when it's Zeus himself in disguise. There are stories in Greek myth where Zeus disguises himself as a poor beggar and goes down to kind of test the generosity and the hospitality of humanity. And so this idea that you treat every stranger who comes to your door with any hospitality you can give him or her, as a way of respecting the umbrella under that Zeus provides over these kinds of things. He's a god of oracles, which we'll explore just in a couple of minutes here. Now, the principal oracle deity is the god Apollo, and we'll explore that role of him, particularly his role as the god of the oracle at Delphi. But Zeus also played that role in a lesser known place called Dodona, which we'll explore. A very important aspect of deities, oracle deities, as a way of understanding how the ancient Greeks communicated with their gods and believed that the gods communicated with them. Zeus is also associated with fate. I mean, he's not one of the kind of the famous three fates. The Greeks were famously inconsistent about kind of notions of destiny and fate, and again, they're inconsistent with lots of these things. Again, if you're looking for consistency in kind of source texts and belief systems, you're not going to find it amongst the Greek myths. There's almost this idea that if one story is good, four stories is better, and so there's lots of disagreement across texts and authors, which can make it very kind of frustrating to try to pin things down. But the notion of fate and destiny, there's I would say for the most part, the Greeks kind of they believe that fate and destiny stood even above Zeus. Zeus isn't deciding the fates of human beings and the ultimate destiny of human beings, although there are some stories that suggest that he can tinker with this. He can play with fate and destiny in the way that human beings certainly cannot. But Zeus, by and large, is presented as a deity who's bound by time. He might have a glimpse into the future, but he doesn't have control over the future, and he doesn't really know the future, and so he's bound by kind of a blindness to the future, just like human beings are. Now, Zeus is fairly easy to recognize in ancient art as an older, heavily bearded, middle-aged man. Sometimes with gray hair, sometimes with dark hair. But he's also easily recognized by these kind of tokens of his identity. The eagle is a symbol that's associated with Zeus, and that association with Zeus goes down to even a symbol like the American eagle, a symbol of kind of power, of royalty, of loftiness, of the elite. Many gods and goddesses in the Greek pantheon will have a kind of a representative in the animal world and also in the plant world. And so I don't have it here, but Zeus, the oak tree, was a symbol of Zeus, and again the oak tree having that kind of folkloric association with strength and durability is no accident either. He's also very often wielding the thunderbolt as a symbol. Again, that if you think about an ancient Greek, not understanding the science of a lightning bolt, but even today, even understanding the science of a lightning bolt, it's this flash of tremendous power that you can't really predict. I think it's indicative of kind of the capriciousness, the unpredictability of Zeus, and the power that he has at his fingertips, and the danger of that power in the hands of a god who's so unpredictable. Now, many of the stories that are most famous about Zeus is how he's constantly cheating on Hera, and the Greeks have this. Again, it's kind of an odd paradox. On the one hand, the Greeks would, Zeus was a god of justice and oaths and worthy of the deepest respect and the like. But at the same time, in many of these stories, he's a ridiculous character, and it's almost as if the Greeks love to laugh at Zeus for the ridiculous binds that he would get himself into and the trouble that he would get himself into with his wife Hera and the like. And so it's almost that there's kind of a schizophrenia amongst these persona of the deities, that even some scholars have suggested that even in the Greek mind, they could split these things up. And so, like, this altar over here, you would worship Zeus as a god of justice and oaths, and this poet would sing a song about Zeus, the guy cheating on his wife. And it's almost as if you could think of them as two different deities. I know that's not the way we like to think about Zeus. We want a kind of a coherent whole here, but again, I think it's a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance. Now, I want to look at briefly just a couple of places, sanctuary sites that were deeply associated with Zeus, as a way of kind of understanding the role that he played in ancient Greek culture. And the first we're going to look at is way up here, the sanctuary of Dodona, which was the principal oracle site of Zeus. My sense is this is not a very well-known aspect of Greek mythology. It doesn't make its way into the kind of the popular retellings, but it's a fascinating one and an important one too. And then we'll make our way down here to Olympia, which is better known. This is the place where the Olympic Games were initiated by the Greeks, by our calendar in 776 BC. And it's a tradition that was revived in the modern world. Every 4 years, just like the ancient Greeks did, we celebrate the Olympic Games, and still in the Summer Games have many of the same events that the Greeks had nearly 3,000 years ago. But it was a sanctuary dedicated primarily to Zeus. So let's have a look at a couple of these things. Now, Dodona, way up here, um, in northwestern Greece, is way off the beaten path. It was off the beaten path in antiquity, and it's still off the beaten path today. And so it doesn't make its way onto kind of the regular tourist trail of people going to Greece today and hitting the sites. But it's a remarkable place if you can get there. And it sits in this valley in kind of this unspoiled kind of trough of nature there. And when you approach it today, the first thing you see is this massive theater that still stands in very good repair here. Here's a shot walking up the hill to the top of the theater, and there you can kind of see the valley, see a bit of the beauty of the valley in Dodona. I took this picture in January, which isn't the prettiest time to be in Greece, so things are still kind of brown. But imagine this with green trees and flowering bushes and such. It comes to life. So this theater here today, you can see a bit of it has been kind of refurbished over here, and the locals still will use it for concerts and plays. But travelers in antiquity going to Dodona wouldn't have gone there primarily for the theater. They would have continued down this trail this way. They'd be heading to the Oracle. And so here's a drawing of what it may have looked like in antiquity. There's the full theater. We know that at one point there was a stadium. So athletics and drama were fully integrated into the ancient religion. In fact, for the Greeks, there was no separation of church and state. Anything that was done publicly, like a drama performance or an athletic competition, was done under the aegis of religion. These were religious festivals. We'll see this more and more again as we go on. So a traveler would traveled here, gone through the gate, and what they were heading to probably primarily was this little sanctuary right here, which wasn't much to look at when it was fully in use and fully built, and even less so today. And this site here was the site where the oracle of Zeus at Dodona was practiced. And again, if you don't know the story, and like so many places when you travel in Greece today and you go to an archaeological ruin, things are reduced to the foundations as you see them here. And even unless you kind of know the story behind them, it's easy to say, oh great, another pile of rocks. But once you know the story, these things come to life and are so very interesting and invigorating. So what we know is that in antiquity there was a courtyard here. You can see that the foundation of the wall is still there. And in the corner of the courtyard, right where this tree is growing now, of course this is not the original tree, was thought to be kind of the sacred oak tree of Zeus. And remember, the oak tree is a symbol of Zeus, as kind of a symbol of his living presence here on the earth. And it was that sacred oak tree that grew in this spot that was thought to be, in some ways, kind of a connection between heaven and earth. Kind of jutting into the courtyard here, you can still see the foundations. There was a kind of, we don't think it was really a temple. It was probably more like a dormitory for the priests that ran the site. This was an oracle. There were only certain days of the year that it was open, and so you had to, if you wanted to consult the oracle, you had to plan accordingly. And so this likely was a place for the priest to stay, to sleep, stay out of the rain, while the oracle was functioning. But the process went something like this. Here's a drawing of what it may have looked like at its height. The high walled sanctuary, an entry porch here, and then there's that back dormitory. There's the courtyard, and here's your oak tree. A couple of the priests here mingling around. But the process was, so an oracle would be a place where you would go if you wanted to ask a question of the deity. Now, like I said earlier, Apollo was the principal oracle deity for the Greeks, and he kind of gets all the press. But Zeus played this role here too at Dodona. And so what you would do is you would travel to the oracle, probably stand in line, and what you would do is you would write your question on a small little strip of lead. And that, for archaeologists, this is a gold mine, because lots of these lead strips with the questions on them survive. So we know a lot about the questions that people would ask. It's a great window into this practice. Now, we know less about the answers that were given. We think that the answers were given orally by the priests, and so a lot of those simply don't survive. But you would hand your question to a priest that would meet you on the forecourt. It's very unlikely that any visitor would be allowed into the sacred courtyard. And then the priests, what they would do is they would consult Zeus, and the way they would do this, it said, they would listen for the wind rustling through the oak trees. At one point, there were also cauldrons that will ring around the trees with the lips of the cauldrons touching each other, and by hitting one, it would send kind of a resounding, kind of eerie, kind of humming sound around it. This always makes me think of like when you put your finger around the rim of a wine glass, and it kind of has that kind of the eerie kind of whistling sound. But between that and the rustling of the wind in the trees, that was believed to be kind of the language, the speaking in tongues of Zeus. And the priests were trained to interpret that, and then they would come out and they would give an answer to your particular question. And by all accounts, this oracle was operating for hundreds of years, and like Delphi, like Apollo's oracle at Delphi, it had a reputation of being very reliable. There's a wonderful little museum nearby in Dodona, or near Dodona, that has a room with a number of these lead strips of the questions that were asked. And so you can see on this lead strip here, seems to be a very elaborate question here, a shorter question on this small lead strip. And what's really interesting is that these questions run the gamut, from the questions that you might expect, a delegation from a city coming in and asking, should we go to war with so and so, or should we found this colony? But you also get these questions that are kind of unintentionally funny. There's one that literally says something like, Philestheus stole my hat, or I think Philestheus stole my hat. Did he? Or I lost my bag. Where is it? So imagine people traveling. Well, who knows how long these people travel, but traveling for miles to ask Zeus where they left their bag. It's extraordinary. So the questions run the gamut from kind of the serious questions of state to the small, trivial, kind of petty kinds of questions. So for so many of them, I would love to know what answer. I would love to know if Zeus knew where the guy's bag was. Now, Olympia, down here, so Dodona's up here in this region we call it Pyrrhus, and Dodona is down here on the west, near the western coast of what we call the Peloponnesus, the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece. And this was by far the better known and more popular festival site. So the ancient Olympics was a huge part of a kind of ancient Greek, kind of pan-Hellenic, pan-Greek identity. The myth was that they were founded by Heracles. You probably, if you're again familiar with Greek mythology, you probably have heard the name Hercules. For whatever reason, that's the Roman name for the same guy. But when you hear Hercules and Heracles, it refers to the same figure, same person. We'll be using the term Heracles because that's closer to his Greek name. Heracles invented, but according to the myth, lots of these sports like wrestling and boxing, and it's with the actions of that hero that the Olympics began. So starting in the year 776 BCE, by our calendar, right around the same time Hesiod and Homer are doing their thing. This is another thing that kind of brings the Greeks out of this dark ages. Every 4 years, they would celebrate this Olympic athletic festival. There was a lot more to it than athletics, but that was kind of the main spectacle. And in the off years, they had other games, the Nemean games, the Pythian games, Isthmian games. So every year you would have, very likely, again, the calendar changes every so often, but more or less every year there would be some organized pan-Hellenic, pan-Greek athletic festival that was in a different region of the Peloponnesus, and they all had kind of their stature. They all had higher or lesser degrees of prominence, and the Olympics was the big one. It was like like in tennis, Wimbledon, or in golf, the Masters. This was the big tournament, and if you won at the Olympics, then your name was forever in the books of the immortals. And the Greeks were great record keepers, and so we know a lot about these games. They kept records of winners of various events. Now, it's not unbroken, but for the better part of almost 1,000 years, we have records from 776 all the way to the year 217 AD, records of winners and names. So we know lots about who was performing these events, and what kinds of events they were doing. And it varies throughout the year, but you have core events like sprints, wrestling, boxing. One of the popular events was called the Pankration, which was a brutal event. Pankration means every blow. It was kind of a no holds barred kind of ultimate fighting championship, and there were years where the fight was only over until one of the fighters was dead. Things odd to the modern eye: warriors racing in full armor with helmets and spears and shields, horse racing, the pentathlon, a grouping of 5 events. A lot of these things have corollaries, of course, in the modern summer games. But what was going on here? So why did the Greeks do these things? Well, for one of the reasons, I think it was kind of a safe way to do war. That is, you could compete with your rival Greek city. And it's important to remember that when we talk about ancient Greece, there was no nation of Greece. You had pockets of power. You had Athens, you had Sparta, you had Corinth, you had Megara, you had Thebes, and they all had their own culture and dialect and governments, and they were very often at war with one another. And most of the events in the Olympic Games were they celebrated that military ideal. If you were good at these things, chances are it would make you a great warrior. So to compete on the athletic field, with the Pankration being an exception, you could defeat your enemy without killing them, and so it was like I said, a safe way to do war. So Olympia itself, a very ancient sanctuary, dedicated, it seems, in its infancy to Zeus, and it remains dedicated to Zeus until the Olympic Games are finally shut down, I believe, in the 4th century, the 300s A.D. Early on, we know that the games were dominated by the Spartan athletes. If you know anything about ancient Sparta, they had this warrior culture where young boys were brought up in barracks and trained to be ultimate warriors, and so it stands to reason that these kinds of athletes, these men, would dominate these games. Yeah, here's the date. So it was ultimately abolished in the year 393. So it had over a 1,000-year history when a late Roman emperor by the name of Theodosius banned it on the grounds of religion. Theodosius was was an early Christian emperor, and so the Olympics was a pagan festival in celebration of a pagan deity, and so it was closed down. But what a run it had! Here's an aerial shot of what Olympia looks like today. It's a fabulous archaeological site, and untrammeled by. There's a modern town of Olympia that's right over here, but the archaeological site itself is it's not covered by a modern town. As so often these sites are, and make them difficult to excavate and to study. But the ancient sanctuary of Olympia has been almost fully excavated, and so lots of. There's not a lot of really impressive freestanding temples or buildings left. This is an area of Greece that is very prone to earthquakes and has done a number on the site over the years. But it is a site that when you walk through it and you study it, you get a very good sense of what it was like in antiquity. The most famous part of it, 2 parts of it are, here's the famous Temple of Zeus. You'll see there's not much left of it today, where this magnificent statue of Zeus that was once one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world once sat. And then the stadium itself, which is a fascinating place in that the way it looks today is probably very much the way it looked like in antiquity. The Greeks took advantage kind of a natural kind of bowl here, kind of between hill 1 and hill 2 here, and you just kind of flatten out and kind of carve out the valley between them, and you have a running track. You have a stage for the vast majority of the events of the games, and the spectators could simply gather on the hillsides. So as the Greeks would often build their big structures, they would kind of incorporate them into nature rather than impose them upon nature. Now here's a drawing that kind of shows the site of what it may have looked like at its height. Again, this big temple of Olympian Zeus, which was built and designed by the same people that designed the Parthenon in Athens, which we'll look at when we talk about Athena. It seems that this was the first temple that was built on the site was a temple that was dedicated to both Zeus and Hera. Its foundations are still there, and the altar in front there was the kind of the hot spot, the most sacred spot on the site. This is still where they will light the Olympic torch before the games, and before that flame is passed along on many torches around the world. I'll show you a picture of that ceremony that still takes place there. Various what the Greeks called palestra, kind of wrestling grounds, training grounds. If your city-state was wealthy enough and you were an elite athlete, they could send you there to train year-round in the hopes that you could bring glory to your city-state during the games. Over here, here's the entrance to the stadium. All these little mini temples here, what we call treasuries. And so, if athletes from a city-state were victorious, city-states were more or less obligated to thank Zeus by building a small votary, or leaving what we call these treasuries behind and filling them with gifts to the god. And so as a result, Olympia, which was a sanctuary that belonged to all Greeks, became very, very wealthy, like many of these places, because people would leave their offerings in gold and silver to the gods. This is a drawing of what the Temple of Zeus may have looked like. We have lots of eyewitness accounts of people who went there. I shouldn't say lots, but some. We have a good idea, again, from the foundation. Archaeologists can recreate its dimensions, and so it was kind of a squat, what we call Doric style temple. Many students who are new to this are often surprised by the colors up here. We're so used to thinking about these ancient Greek temples as being kind of stark, monochromatic, kind of that goldish, yellowish marble, when in fact we know that the upper reaches of them were heavily painted in reds and pinks and blues and oranges, to a degree that I think if you were to see them in all their glory, you'd probably say, wow, that's really in bad taste. It looks kind of garish. We're so used to the kind of that classical monochromatic look as kind of part of its allure, you might say. But this might have been what the temple would have looked like. Inside, again, I show you drawings here. We have a good idea of what the statue looked like because we do have eyewitness descriptions of it, but it's completely lost. Here's two different artist renderings of it. We know that it was a massive figure of a seated Zeus with the eagle-winged scepter in one hand, the little winged victory goddess Nike is her name, which the shoe company gets its name from, in the other hand on a throne. And you can see by this drawing here of these couple of people here for scale how massive indeed it was. And in fact, it became a tourist attraction in its own right. People came to Olympia just to see the statue, and then it later makes this list of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And of those 7 wonders, 6 are completely lost. And ironically, the one that's still standing, the pyramids of Giza at Egypt, are the oldest of all of those. But this is one of the famous completely lost ones. Now, this is what the temple looks like today. And yeah, it's kind of a pathetic ruin here. And again, it's not like this one column survived miraculously. That would be really weird. But the restorers have kind of set up a column just to give visitors a sense of the height of the temple that was there. But this temple was ravaged by earthquakes. 2 big ones hit not that far apart and really just leveled it. Once the sanctuary was closed down, once the games were shut down in 393, it was really kind of left to rot, and it was looted. And people would, as these temples collapsed, locals would take stones away and use them to build their houses and their walls and their farms and their churches. And so it really is a site that's been picked clean, so to speak. So that's a little sad, but it's there's still enough here that we know a lot more about this site than we would many others. Yeah, so here a couple of big earthquakes hit in the years 522 and 551 CE AD. And here you can see, I love this picture. It's one of these things, either you have kind of an eye for this kind of stuff or you don't. It's subjective. Either you find beauty in this or you don't. I do. I love this kind of stuff. But here, the earthquake hit and the columns collapsed. And here they've lain basically unmoved for the last 1,500 years, and it's revealing. You see how the architects built these columns, the same way they did at the Parthenon. They built them. They didn't carve just one big column out from the quarry, polish it up, and set it up. No, they cut it. It was drums. and then they would stack them, and you can even see these holes by which they would peg these columns together. And once they had them set up, then they would polish them to a sheen where you'd have to look really, really close to see the seam between them. And so even this is kind of educational to some degree, as well as having kind of a tragic, haunting beauty to them as well. And then the athletes on the days of the big events, they would process, like a football player, coming out into the stadium. They'll process through a tunnel. This what you see is actually built by the Romans. The Romans carried on lots of Greek festivals, and they carried on the Olympic Games and added to them. Usually, when you see an arch like this, that means Roman architecture. The Greeks did not build with the arch as part of that was not in their arsenal. So you see one little ridge of this arch, but imagine all of this covered in darkness. And so the athletes were actually looking from the stadium back into the sanctuary, so they would have come in this direction and then emerged into the sunlight out onto the stadium. And this is a picture I took just a couple of years ago. And yes, like I said, the stadium probably looks today very much like it did in antiquity. The starting line for the runners is still there. They said, look, the spectators would have gathered on the hillsides, and some foundations here of maybe some seats for some VIPs sitting here, at the 50-yard line. An altar here, reminding us that what you're looking at is a religious, kind of cultic festival. Again, no separation between public athletic festival and worshiping the gods. Here's a close-up of. Actually, I'll go back here. See this kind of strip of stone on the ground there. This is a close-up of it. It's kind of this two grooves that run the length of it. We're not exactly sure, but we think that it probably functioned, as you see this guy's feet here, as a kind of starting block. Runners would line up next to each other, dig their toes into the grooves, and at the signal they would take off running. And as I'm sure some of you know, that the Olympics were the athletes competed in the nude, which sounds so odd and I don't know, counterproductive to the modern eye and ear. But we'll look at this too. We'll kind of consider nudity finds its way into lots of ancient Greek art. And I think it often will strike the modern eye differently than it did for the ancients. Nudity, particularly masculine nudity, was associated with the divine. And so when you have these athletes competing in the nude, it was not meant to be ridiculous. It was not meant to be sexualized. It was meant to kind of reflect how close these athletes were to divinity. It meant to the viewer that these were men that were greater than human. In this moment, at this moment, in this festival. Here's a picture of a torch lighting ceremony. So what you're looking at here's the front, the remains of that temple of Zeus and Hera, the first temple that was built on the site, and the skeletal remains of the altar that sat in front of that site. We think that the first sacrifices and what's the word I'm looking for? Rituals were conducted right in this spot here. So when it comes time to light the Olympic torch, the Greeks today will choose some young women and dress them in the manner of kind of ancient priestesses, and they will go there. It's a photo opportunity, and they catch the sun in this kind of this concave bowl here to light the torch in that sacred area, and then that torch, the flame on that torch is passed to hundreds of other torches, and it's carried around the world. So Greece is still recognized, or the origin of the Olympics in Greece is still recognized. And when you see the Parade of Nations in both the summer and the Olympic Games, they will the teams will process alphabetically according to the language of the country that they're in, except for Greece. Greece always comes in first. As a kind of a recognizing the debt that the world owes to the Greeks. Now Hera, quickly here. So Hera, unfortunately, she, in terms of mythology associated with her, she pales in comparison to Zeus. She really plays this thankless role as being the woman who's constantly being cheated upon, and always trying to get back at her husband, and her Zeus is too powerful for her to take the revenge that she wants to take, and so she'll often go after the object of Zeus's desires. We'll see a number of examples of this throughout. But like Zeus, with his core being a sky god, Hera, though she is fully anthropomorphized as an older matronly woman, she is at her core an earth goddess. So we still have that Hieros Gamos, that holy marriage, that pairing of a sky god and an earth goddess. And despite the fact that her husband is cheating on her all the time, she is a goddess of childbirth and stable marriage, even though her own marriage is not very stable. And as such, she's kind of an antithesis to Aphrodite. We'll explore this, is that, often the gods and goddesses will be, you can kind of pair them with other gods and goddesses, and they kind of balance each other out. And so Hera represents stable marriage and married love and respect, while Aphrodite represents kind of the lust and wild, libidinous sex that will often destroy committed relationships. So, Hera is stable in that regard, where Aphrodite is unstable. So it's kind of a yin yang kind of balancing act there. Here's a couple of typical portrayals of Hera. Kind of in an older, middle-aged woman. She you see this crown. Excuse me. She has these kind of agricultural symbols on her crown here. Over here, she has this dish. It's kind of washed out here, but it has seeds in it. And so her accoutrements remind us of her associations with earth and the fertility of the earth, and the fertility of the earth kind of corresponds to the fertility of the body, and there you get childbirth and the like. But here she carries the scepter, just like Zeus does. She is the queen of the gods, whereas Zeus is the king of the gods. Now, in terms of sanctuaries dedicated to Hera, we don't have a lot of kind of sanctuaries dedicated just to Hera. Wherever Zeus was worshipped, Hera kind of by default would have been worshipped as well, but she certainly stands in his shadow. Probably the most famous exception to this is on the island of Samos here, down off the west coast of what we call Turkey today. This was all Greek lands back in antiquity. And the island of Samos here was a center of culture and learning for the Greeks for many years. Pythagoras himself was from Samos here, and this is where Hera had a famous sanctuary, a massive sanctuary. Again, there's not much left of it, but here you see one column. This has been kind of reset up. It looks a little bit precarious to me, doesn't it? By the archaeologists here. Again, the original temple leveled by an earthquake, but when it was fully built, it was a massive temple. Look at this woman standing down here. Her head barely clears the base for the column, and so probably at its height, her temple would have several columns, almost 80 feet high, to the degree where you could have taken the whole temple of Zeus at Olympia and fit it inside the central room of Hera's temple. They tended to build temples in, again, what we call Turkey today, on a much more massive scale than they did on the Greek mainland there. Here's a vase painting of Zeus. Here we see her again in her role as the queen of the gods on her royal throne there up on Olympus. There she's got her dish of seeds, grain. There her scepter has, you can see the sheaf of wheat at the top of it, all the kind of those agricultural earth fertility symbols. And on the back of the throne, you see the eagle of Zeus, reminding us who she's married to. All right, that's plenty for Zeus and Hera. See you soon.